all have stories to tell, but sometimes it's hard to understand which stories to tell and why do we tell them in order to grow our business. Well, stay tuned because in this information packed episode of the Author Switch podcast, I'm going to be sharing with you just how to do that.
Are you an entrepreneur, small business owner, or consultant looking to boost your authority, influence, and impact? The Author Switch podcast with best-selling, award-winning author Carma Spence is your answer. Tune in for actionable advice, powerful strategies, and engaging interviews to turn on your author switch and take your business to the next dimension.
The Author Switch.
Hello, and welcome to the Author Switch podcast. My name is Carma Spence, and I help entrepreneurs write a lead attracting, client attracting book in 90 days or less. Yes, you can get it done in 90 days or less if you follow my methodology. Anyway, beside the point, today I am talking about the hidden gems in your life. These are the little stories and the big stories that you experience just by being alive that you can use to grow your business. Did you know you could do that? Did you know that telling stories about your own life can help you attract right fit clients, can help grow your business, can help make you the go to expert in your field? Yes, even seemingly ir- irrelevant stories. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. And since I've got a lot of information to share with you, I'm going to get right to it. So first, I would just want to set the groundwork and talk a little bit about the power of a personal story. Why is it important to share your personal stories with your audience? You see, every trial and challenge and success that you experience in life more than likely has some universal lesson that you can use to share a commonality with the members of your audience. Because sharing your triumphs and your challenges helps make you relatable. When you share your genuine self, and that includes the silly things that happen in your life, the mundane things that happen in your life, it helps make you relatable. But you don't wanna just recount events. So, for example, this is a great example, and I love this story that this particular person tells. Dan Henry tells the story of how he discovered, or actually his wife discovered, the almond milk maker, and how it totally changed his view on almond milk, and then he applies that story to how are we doing things in our life that we're just doing it because we think that's the way to do it when there's a better way. And I've actually heard him tell this story and come up with a different lesson like 2 or 3 different times. Same story, different lesson. It depends on what message he's trying to get through. You have stories just like that, that you can tell from your life. So, what you want to do is frame these personal stories, frame them so that they are illustrating a point that you want to make. So, for example, I have a story where I talk about back in the 70s when I was a kid, the Sinbad movie came out. I believe it's The Golden Voyage. And one of the characters in the movie has an eye upon her hand. And I was really into it. And so I would take a pen and I was in sitting class and I would draw this little eye on my hand. And one of my classmates saw it. She wanted it, but she didn't like the way she drew it on her hand. So she asked me to draw it on her hand and she paid me 25 cents. Long story short, by the next day, I had people lining up during recess to pay me 25 cents to draw an eye on their hand. And I use that story to talk about number one, you can sell anything if people perceive there's value in it. I also have used it to talk about how you can turn even the mundane things that you can sell into hot properties if you market it right. So, same story, different lessons. You frame the story talking about me drawing eye on my hand, that makes me relatable. I did this thing, I was creative, whatever people like you probably have a creative streak, otherwise you probably wouldn't want to express yourself in a book. And honestly, I believe that everyone's creative. So even if you don't believe you are creative, guess what? Ding, you're creative. And that's how we relate. We relate like we were both kids. We both went to elementary school. Yes, we know that kids do stupid stuff. There, we have a commonality, right? And so what you do is you take these stories and you strategically use them to highlight messages. And the way you find this is you think about your journey. And I mean your journey from the first moment you can remember to today. What stories keep playing in your mind over and over again? They probably have a universal story. They probably do. They connected those stories, and by now they may not even be 100% true because our memory plays tricks on us, but it doesn't matter. It's a story that you've been telling yourself for a long time, and and it sticks in your mind because there's a purpose for it. And what you need to do is figure out what that purpose is and does it apply to your business. So that's like the power of personal story. It adds ambiance and verisimilitude, and I can't think of another fun big word to use to your business. It makes you human, it makes you vulnerable, it makes you relatable. And that is really important in these days. So now, part 2 here. How do you sift through your life? So first thing you do is you do this inventory of your life stories. Have a Google Doc. Every time you think of a new story, jot it down. Jot it down. Do that for oh, just never stop doing it actually, but do it until you have, 4 or 5 stories to start this process first. So now you've collected all these stories in a Word doc or a Google Doc. It doesn't matter. Could be a notepad. It doesn't matter where you store them, just have them. Have them right down, and it doesn't even have to be fully fleshed out. Just, like, "Oh, remember that time I drew an eye on the hand," or "Remember that time when I stood up to a bully," or, whatever the story is. "That time my wife told me about the almond milk maker." That's all you need, a trigger point. Now you need to sift through those stories and identify what the lessons learned either were or can be and how they relate to your business. So, first, you reflected on your life, you've listed some stories. That's step one. And again, you put it in a notepad or a Google Doc or a Word doc, it doesn't matter. Then you take a look at these stories and what are the themes? Identify the themes that are coming through in these stories. So, for example, in my eye example, maybe the theme is sales. That applies to sales. It may also apply to mindset. It could apply to marketing. So those are 3 kind of broad themes that that little story from my life could apply to. Step 3, evaluate the impact of that story. Each moment, ask yourself, how did it change you? What lessons did you learn? What lessons could you learn today from that? And list that down. So you might have, like, let's say you've got a Google Doc and you've got page 1, story about the eye. And then underneath that, you'll just list some themes that it could belong to, what kind of things you could learn, and you're just jotting down these broad stroke notes. In fact, I might create a handout that'll help you do this. I haven't created it yet. I just got the idea to do it. If I do, it'll be in the show notes. Next, so now you've got all these notes about what that story means to you and to your business. Now you need to connect the dots to how does it apply to your audience? How does and you need to come up with a beginning, a middle, and end, make it into a story so that has a story structure. So, like in my example with the eye on the hand, start, beginning. I saw a movie and was intrigued by this thing. Middle. I started doing the thing and somebody wanted me to do it for them. And I had a long line of people wanting to pay me 25 cents to draw an eye on their hand. Beginning, middle, end, and then you add in the moral. It's kind of like a He-Man story. I don't know if you ever watched He-Man, but it always ended with a moral. And He-Man would say, He-Man or Prince, was it Cassian? I don't know, whatever his name was. He'd say, and the moral of today's story is blah, blah, blah. And he would name it out. You can do that. Next step, craft your arc. Now, this is for a larger piece. So you've got all these little stories. Where do they fit in the greater arc of whatever you're trying to do right now? So if you've got your book has an end message that you want to have, right? So what stories from your, or I'm just going to say Google Doc from now on, what stories from your Google Doc can you use that point to that end message in your book? And then create your arc. Because those stories, they may not go in chronological order, but they will go in some sort of thematic order that leads your reader from the beginning of your book to the end result of your book, with those stories pulling them along your book. And each time you tell one of these stories, highlight the universal lesson. So, for example, I was telling you with the eye that one universal lesson could be that you can sell almost anything if it's framed right. And then finally, be yourself, be vulnerable. Now, there was nothing terribly vulnerable about the Eye on the Hand, except that I had to tell you that I was cognizant at the time that the movie came out, which kind of dates me, but I am how old I am. That's just, I can't change that. I just have to be okay with it. So I am. There you go. So now you've got your stories, right? But now you've got to really make them readable, tellable, interesting. So I'm going to share with you a couple of story frameworks. The first one is your basic. This is perfect for the little short ones. And that is one that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So the beginning is your setup. You're giving people enough background information so that they can start on the same page with you. For example, I said, this movie came out and I did this thing. I didn't just start off with, one day I was drawing an eye on my hand. You're going to sit there thinking, why would you draw an eye on your hand? Well, I was drawing an eye on my hand because I saw this movie. So that's the setup. The middle is sometimes called the confrontation. This is where the action happens. This is where, so in this particular story, that's where I'm doing this thing and someone went, "Hey, I want you to do this thing for me." And I was like, "What?" But I did it. It could be anything, but this is where the meat of the story happens. It's the confrontation. It's not always a confrontation. It could be a confrontation, a transformation. It's where the stuff happens. So, like, if you're telling a pirate story, this is going to be where the pirates, like go attack another ship, and then there's this big battle, and all the shells are with them. Then they got on the other boat, and they that's the middle. The end, this is the end, this is the resolution. So you've had the setup that explains why you're having this middle, but the middle can't just go on forever. There needs to be a conclusion, an ending, a resolution, something that ties it up with a nice little bow so there isn't a loop anymore. And that is, so I had this long line and they paid me money. And I mean, I could tell you I also took all that money and bought candy with it, which I wasn't supposed to do. I was a naughty girl. Anyway, you tie up that action. The action in the middle leads to some resolution, which is often your lesson, your point, your message. So that is the basic framework. Now I'm going to share with you a word from our sponsor, and afterwards, I will share with you the next framework.
The future of entrepreneurial book writing has arrived. In an age where information moves at the speed of light and innovation is a business requirement, one book stands as the North Star for the authors of tomorrow. In You Can Make It to the Finish Line, Carma Spence decodes the mysteries of writing a book that markets your business, offering a blueprint to navigate the frontiers of writing, editing, and publishing. With accessible techniques and visionary insight, this guide propels you forward so that your expertise can transform into impact. Step into your future, transform your vision into a legacy. You can make it to the finish line, where your author's journey meets the future. Available now on Amazon.
Well, hello and welcome back to the Author Switch podcast. I am your host, Carma Spence, and I help entrepreneurs write a lead or client attracting book in 90 days or less. Before the commercial break, I shared about the importance of a personal story and how to sift through the stories of your life so that you can pick out the ones that make sense for your business. And then I shared with you a basic 3-part story framework. This next framework I'm going to share with you is a little bit longer and is great for a longer work. You're probably not going to do the whole thing for a short story, but even your short 3-part thing will have elements from this particular framework, and you probably have heard of it before. Yes, it's the hero's journey. The hero's journey story framework is really powerful because it gets into how our brains are wired for story. So I'm going to go over the whole arcing of it, and then I will go back and tell you which pieces are the most important if you're going to truncate it. So it always starts out in what's called the ordinary world. That's your before state. That's, you're living your life before whatever happens. That's your ordinary world. So in the example of the I story, my ordinary world was I was a little girl and I went to a movie. That's ordinary. What happened at the movie started a chain reaction of things. Step 2 is the call to adventure. This is where you're pulled from your ordinary world and given the opportunity to do something perhaps extraordinary. To example, my call to adventure was my keen interest in the eye on the hand. That sparked a creative spark that made me want to make it for myself. So that was my call to adventure. I could have said, "Oh, that's really cool," and not done anything about it, but I chose to take the call and draw an eye on my hand. Now, the next step is often what happens, and that is the refusal of the call. Now, in a way, I had 2 calls. One call to adventure was to do the eye. The second call for me was when the person said to me, "I will pay you 25 cents if you will draw an eye on my hand." Now, I could have said, "Oh, go blow." Well, I wouldn't have said that, but I mean, I could have said, "That's stupid. I'm not going to do that." But I accepted that call to adventure. But I have to admit, my first reaction was, "You wanna pay me 25 cents?" So there was a momentary, brief refusal of that call, and we all have that. Whenever we are called to something greater, there's a part of us that goes, "I don't wanna do that because 'cause I've never done that before." And you need to acknowledge that in your story. Acknowledge that little, "Huh? Huh?" Sometimes it's bigger than others. Sometimes it's just that little doubt. Another example of this refusal of the call. When my husband first proposed to me, we'd only been going out for a few months. And I knew that I would marry him at some point. I knew that. But when he asked, I was feeling like, is this too soon? Is this too, and it took me probably seconds to come to the point where, yeah, duh, of course I'm going to marry you. But there was that moment where I was like, should I? Should I? And that kind of came out with the infamous lines of, "Seriously? Seriously? Really? Seriously?" Probably not the answer he was looking for. Actually, exactly not the answer he was looking for. That's an example of that refusal to call. Sometimes it takes only seconds, and then you accept the call. Step number 4, meet the mentor. Now, in the case of these 2 stories, there was no mentor, but in a larger story, a larger piece, there usually is. So, for example, a good example that people give is like Bilbo meets Gandalf. Gandalf is the mentor. If you're doing a case study, so for example, I could tell the case story. So and so had this issue. They were in the ordinary world, they were experiencing an issue. They saw that I could help them, and that was their call to adventure. But then they were like, "I don't know. I don't know if I'm ready to write a book yet." That's the refusal. But now they hop on a call with me and they meet me. They've met their mentor. Step number 4. So that's sort of a story that you could tell. Step 5 is crossing the threshold. That's when they decide they have heard the call to the adventure, they've met their mentor, and they cross into their official quest, their official adventure. They are now taking the adventure. So for me, in that I story, my crossing the threshold was saying, "Yes, I'll take your 25 cents." Step number 6 is trials, allies, and enemies. Now, sometimes these happen in stories, sometimes they don't, but basically, these are all the little hurdles that people have to jump. So, for example, when I do a map of the author's journey, I show all these milestones, and at each of these milestones, there are little mind goblins that go bleh and stop people in their tracks. Those are the trials, those are the enemies, but they have allies too. That would be, say, for example, I am an ally, but they also have maybe people in their group or a writer's group or meetings or all these different software that can help them do, like AI can be an ally. Step number 7, approach the inmost cave. Now, this is where the hero ventures into the unknown, and it's the most significant challenge in their journey. This is the biggest goblin, so to speak, that they face. And often they have to go inside and flip a switch so that they can continue their journey. So, for example, if I was doing this case study, that might be they crossed the threshold and decided to work with me. They started writing the book, but then all of a sudden, stuff kept coming up and they kept not writing their book and not writing the book and not writing their book because they hadn't addressed a specific mind goblin. That could be that. And so then they realized this and they did the inner work that they needed to do so they could trudge on and reach the finish line. Step number 8, that is the ordeal. Now, in the author's journey, the ordeal is in the mind of the beholder, but I often find that the biggest ordeal that most people go through is that sort of pre-launch, launch, just post-launch phase, because that's where their baby that they've spent 90 days or less or more working on, they've put it out into the world. They have to deal with some software, they have to maybe deal with some finances, they have to deal with all these things potentially going wrong, and then it's out there in the world, and then does it sell? Does it sell? Does it sell? That's the ordeal. But they get to the other side because it always sells. Well, I suppose sometimes it doesn't sell so much, and then they figure out why and fix it. Number 9, that is the reward. I call it the golden fleece. This is you've got your book in hand. Oh my gosh, it feels so good to have your book in hand. Oh my gosh. This or your reward could be now clients are buying my book and saying, "Hey, I want to work with you." Maybe they're getting speaking gigs, maybe they're getting media attention, all because they went through the ordeal. They went on their author's journey. They made it to the other side. They made it to the finish line and they had their book in hand and is out in the world. Now is the slow road back. That's number 10 is the slow road back where the hero takes the lessons that they've learned and they bring it back into the ordinary world. So now, you've had your ordinary world. That was at the beginning. Now they have a new ordinary world. In this new ordinary world, they have a book. Yeah. Sometimes there is a resurrection that happens next. That's number 11, where there might be a final test. So maybe you've got your book out there in the world. Maybe you're attracting some clients and you realize, you know what? Hmm, they're not quite the right fit I thought they were. So I need to adjust my book. Or it could be that something else happens in their life and they have to take time off from marketing. There's all sorts of things that could happen, but it's that final test that tests your mettle, but you make it through. And when you do that, You return with the elixir, and the elixir is your message. This is the magic thing that you offer. That's what you help people get. You help people get that elixir and make use of it. So there is 2 frameworks, the basic 3 part and the really long one, which the most important pieces of the hero's journey that needs to kind of be in every story, there always needs to be some form of ordinary world. That's your before state. Then there's a call to adventure. Sometimes there's a meet a mentor, sometimes there isn't, but if you want them to work with you, you might want to work that one in. There's some trials and tribulations, some action that goes on, and then there's a reward. Those are the most important pieces of the hero's journey that you want to include in your story. Now, before I end this episode of The Author Switch, I want to share with you 3 additional tips to help you bring your stories to life. 1, and this is probably the piece of advice you've probably heard it many times, but it's oh so true. And that is show, don't tell. Don't just say, okay, I took a pen and I drew the eye and bring in the senses. Tell the story in a way that makes your audience feel like they are there. Kind of like the old Walter Cronkite story. You are there. So use vivid descriptions, use anecdotes, use examples, and think about the 5 senses. So you've got your sight. What are you seeing when you're telling a story? What are you hearing when you're telling this story? Are you tasting or smelling something when you tell the story? What are you feeling? And there's 2 ways to feel. You can actually feel texture or you can feel emotion. And the thing is, when you use visual and auditory cues, that often gets you into the emotion. Number 2, and this plays into this, use emotional triggers. When a story is really important, you want to use emotional triggers that can activate the emotion you're trying to evoke in someone. There are power words, and the main emotions that you want people to experience throughout your story, possibly at first, is maybe uncertainty and fear, but you want to leave the story with hope and relief and maybe some excitement. So you start with the before, which is not always pleasant. You take them through some action and you leave them with hope for the future and excitement to start their adventure. And 3, create a strong hook. Always start with a strong hook, something that brings them into the story and makes them go, ooh, I want to hear that. So, for example, when I said, hey, there was a Sinbad movie, there was a woman with an eye on her hand. That is a roundabout way, a hook, because people who've seen the movie are gonna go, "Oh, yeah, I remember that." And people who don't are like, "An eye on her why is she telling me about an eye on her hand?" And then they'll perk up and go, "Want to hear more." Start with the hook. So, for example, again, I started this podcast with a hook saying, "Hey, we all have stories to tell, but how do you find the ones that'll grow your business?" That was a hook. So there you go. I've shared with you why it's so important to mine your life for those personal stories that will bring your business and your book to life. I shared with you some ways to find those stories and sift through them and attach them to your business. I shared with you 2 story frameworks and an additional 3 tips. I hope you found this episode value. And this is Karma Spence signing off, saying ciao for now. See you next week. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Author Switch podcast and would like to show your support, there are a few ways that you can do that. First, I encourage you to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Additionally, leaving a rating and review would greatly help me reach more listeners and continue providing valuable content. To stay up to date with the Author Switch podcast and gain access to additional information on amplifying your authority, influence, and thought leadership through books, you can follow me on LinkedIn at Karma Spence. For those interested in catching up on previous episodes, including those no longer available on podcast platforms, you can find them all at authorswitch.com/episodes, where you can choose to watch or listen to them at your convenience. Thank you so much for your support and for being a part of the Author Switch community.